when it actually came to how each of us looked and evaluated the risk and how we took in the information we just learned, it was really quite different. And it really did look like partly this difference in mindset, that ego evaluation, and what we were each prepared to do. So I think what's really important is you can't just walk around and be like, oh, there's a dumbass, there's a badass.
Yes, people, labeling is not good.
Right. Good morning and welcome everybody to the Simply Human podcast. This is the podcast and YouTube channel where we explore the common challenges of our shared human experience. And I'm Dr. Christina, Caro, clinical psychologist.
And I'm Karen Lynskey, a leadership and self-trust coach. And today we're diving into a topic that affects every single one of us in different ways, risk-taking.
Yeah, and our episode titled Risk-Taking, Badass or Dumbass comes from a Red Bull documentary called Fine Lines, Life Lessons from Adventure Athletes. And I will put the link down in the show notes because it is a really great documentary that, although it is about climbing and big mountain skiing and all these kind of adventure athletes, the documentary itself is about the life lessons, including things like risk-taking, friendships, life, death, meaning, pursuing goals. So I do think it's applicable to everybody. And one of the professional climbers in it made this observation that there is a fine line between badass and being a dumbass when it comes to taking risks. And when we watch people accomplish extraordinary things, whether it's climbing without a rope or starting a new business or even having that difficult conversation, sometimes we wonder like, wow, is that person just really skillful or are they just lucky and it just didn't crash and burn around them?
And so what I find interesting is how our perceptions on risk-taking depends on the outcome. And the same behavior that might be labeled as courageous if it succeeds or reckless if it fails. This is a dilemma that I see in the business world. So this is the dilemma I see often in the business world. Do I push for that bold idea or do I risk looking like a fool?
Yeah. And I think that's a dilemma in all aspects of life. So today we want to explore what goes in to being a badass rather than sort of accidentally or even intentionally falling into the dumbass territory, because there's real wisdom in understanding the difference. But before we start, consider giving us that thumbs up and subscribing to the channel, because those small steps, which are free, really helps this episode and this podcast get out to more people.
So let's start by defining what we mean by badass risk-taking. Like, to me, it's about someone who has mindfully prepared themselves, right? Mentally,
Yes.
emotionally, or physically, to take that bold action to face uncertainty. So are you seeing it the same way I am? Would you define it the same way?
Yeah, I would definitely define it the same way. I live in a community that prioritizes the outdoor lifestyle and adventure sports. So for those of you who are in cities and suburbs, that's things like climbing big mountains or going into the back country to do big mountain skiing. And for those of you who maybe are in snow sports and you've been to a resort, backcountry is when you are off those groomed trails and you are in avalanche country. Or it might be mountain biking down really rocky chutes, right? We're at 11,000 feet above sea level when you go to the top. So I get to observe a lot of people who I would say are badass because they've done the work. Like, I only climbed with people who had 20 years of experience under their belt. I only went backcountry skiing with people who have had the AVI training or the avalanche training. I took the avalanche training. Like, took that time to gradually and progressively learn how to do bigger and bolder things. Because in this lifestyle, there are so many stories, sadly, of people who have died at a pretty young age. So I get to see both sides of it. Some people who they make reckless decisions, and yeah, I'm not going to be following them into the backcountry. And then I see other people who I so admire who have really put in the time and the energy and are methodical about their goals and approaching those goals. Like they're not eliminating the risk, but they're engaging with it in an intelligent way.
I love how you describe that. And it's so interesting to hear more about that. But let me ask you about the other end of the spectrum. So when you said dumbass, what do you mean by that?
Well, like I said, there are folks who are like full of just chutzpah or they're adrenaline junkies, and they really do just rely on luck or ego. Like they just tell themselves,
Yeah,
"Ah, I could do
I can
that."
do it.
Yeah, I could. That's fine. They have no idea. There's sort of a reckless abandon to it because they're seeking the high of it. And boy, they don't necessarily put that time into preparing. Now, granted, sometimes these folks, they are incredibly lucky. But if you're with that person, do I want to put my life into their hands when you're taking these kinds of risks? And whether or not we're talking about a financial risk or relationship risk or an activity risk, do you want to put yourself into the hands of someone is really relying on luck rather than skill and maybe isn't that great at that self-assessment because of the ego? So
Mm.
I'm going to give you a quick example. I did this avalanche course because I wanted to be able to go at least ski tour into the backcountry because it's beautiful in the wintertime. Now, this is like a certification course, 3 days. The first 2 days are all the ways you can die in the backcountry. Like it's just one story after their group think, not being prepared, just not reading the snow well, not understanding like you shouldn't be going at that angle because of the snow is unstable. So you learn how to dig a pit to evaluate the snow to see where the stability
Oh,
instability is. It's a
interesting.
pretty intensive course, right? How not to die in the back country for 2 days. The third day was the day we were supposed to go apply all our skills, and it was a freaking blizzard. Okay,
Oh
like
my gosh.
well, the thing is, you get the report that morning. We're supposed to go out 13 degrees, blizzard, almost no visibility. And I'm looking at what they just taught us, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is a no-go day. But because it's this class, we still had to go out. And
Yeah.
so I raised my hand immediately. Low risk person right here. Because we were breaking into groups because they said, oh, we should probably break into groups based on experience and blah, blah. So I'm like, right here, low risk. And so I had a whole bunch of beginners join me, and I had a guide who I'd worked with before in climbing. So I really trusted her. And we picked probably the one and only place you could go. It was pretty low angle. I mean, the visibility was still bad, but it wasn't going to have an avalanche risk. Meanwhile, I'm watching the other groups, and they're talking about going to this area that clearly the map that morning showed death zone. I'm watching them going, oh my God, what are they doing? What are they? Oh, this is what they taught us. They taught us like groupthink is a way people die. And nobody is stopping and saying, hey, this is probably not a good idea. So my group went, and it was still really hard. And we went to our low risk, little slopey hill. And eventually, as we got to the top, we found all the other groups ended up going to the exact same day. Because I do think the instructors did step in to those other groups who were talking about going to the high risk zone. And, they weren't going to let them make those bad decisions. But, that's what I mean. It's like, holy smokes, in terms of like dumbassery, like you just spent 2 days learning about how this will kill you. And it was like out the window because of that ego and just the enthusiasm and the adrenaline rush and an idea I had before that I've been wanting to do this. I want to go up into this area and I've been wanting to backcountry ski. So let's go do it regardless of the conditions. Yeah, that was a great example.
That is like, holy cow. Like, That is actually dumbass risk taking because of the fact that what you said, which is interesting, comes with a refusal to acknowledge potential consequences. Like, it won't happen to me. I was just trained. I'll be ready. Right. That
Yes.
bypasses that genuine risk assessment. Like, maybe
Right.
not today yet. Let me train a little bit first. And then, right. Yeah. Oh gosh, gosh. So
Yeah.
glad that the instructor stepped in though. Thank God if they
Right.
had it. Right.
Oh, right, right. And I thought, oh my God, these people are gonna die. So, but it was really interesting to kind of look at the psychological perspective. I mean,
Ah. You
we
saw the
all look.
group think in action, right? That's the thing. You started to see the group
Yeah,
think in
but
action.
think about it. The entire room was filled with people who had the same goal. We all had the
Mm,
same objective of wanting to learn to be safe in the backcountry, or we all wanted just, well, I would assume that's why you're taking an Avi course, is we all had that same goal. So on the surface, we all looked the same.
mhm,
But then when it actually came to how each of us looked and evaluated the risk and how we took in the information we just learned, it was really quite different. And it really did look like this difference in mindset, sort of that ego evaluation, and what we were each prepared to do. I think what's really
mhm.
important is you can't just walk around and be like, oh, there's a dumbass, there's a badass.
Yes,
It's
people,
because then,
labeling is not good.
right. Okay, you
So,
go.
what you just said was a very important point. So, as a coach, I often see this in the business arena where how people actually approach their career risk and relationship challenges, their business relationship challenges, right? That preparation isn't always visible, but it really does make all the difference in the outcome. So, let me ask you about the psychology of risk assessment. What's going on in the brain when we think about that risk?
Well, our brains, and we've talked about this in the past, aren't actually wired to make rational risk assessments. And we've talked about this in terms of cognitive biases or cognitive distortions. So some of the things are like confirmation bias. So let's take the Avi course. Here's this information. I ignore the information that goes against what I'm looking for and what I want to see. I only look for the information that confirms what I already think.
Mm,
Or maybe it's applying something from the past. Oh, I've done something like this in the past and it was fine. And so I'm not really evaluating what's going on in the moment.
mm,
Or I'm thinking how I'm looking at this perception of danger versus opportunity, and how am I determining that risk reward? And we have different risk tolerances. Like I said, I'm actually fairly low risk
yeah,
tolerant, whereas
me
a
too.
lot of people in that room were high risk tolerant. So there's not like the brain is wired to always make that right decision. It's not. There's a lot of things, peer pressure that can get in the way. I don't want to look beta, and all these other people are acting alpha. I don't want to look beta, so I'm going to give into peer pressure. Groupthink was, they gave us an example of how 5 people died because of groupthink. That even though there was like a couple of people saying, hey, I don't think it's a good idea, the majority said, no, no, let's go for it. And so then they all went for it and ended up dying.
Okay. So it reminds me of conversations I've had with my clients where it's really about things that are controllable and the things that are uncontrollable. And a skilled risk taker focus on the energy on what they can control and accepts the things that they can't. It's kind of like that serenity prayer.
And if people aren't familiar, we'll put the Serenity Prayer into the show notes below. So I think that's a really good way to frame it. And there's also that emotional state when we're making that decision. So like fear can paralyze some people, or it can push us. Fear, love can do it. Like there's just so many components to making these decisions. We don't always have the luxury of that time to sit back and let me think about this now. When we have that, we can do that planning, that badass, like they can take that time. But we really are talking about, we're going to focus on that today, is when you have the time, do you take advantage of that time to do the planning and preparation and practice and all the things to elevate your chance of success. Or even given the time, you're like, whatever, that'll be fine. It'll be fine. Yeah, I got this. And it's just the inaccurate evaluation.
Yeah, and I'm learning more and more how much that self-assessment that I do, even around risk, is so important to take. It actually becomes more and more crucial. So, how can understanding our emotional patterns about risk actually help us distinguish between intuitive caution and irrational fear? What have you found?
Well, I think the badass risk taker has developed something that we call emotional fitness for
Ooh,
risks.
I
So
like
they can experience fear without being controlled by it. And they've practiced sitting with uncertainty. So this is something I've had to work on my whole life because I struggle with this internal paradox where I'm pretty risk averse. Like I don't like uncertainty. And this is really common for people on the autistic spectrum. Like we want to know the answer. Is it this or is it that? And the uncertainty is really, really stressful. So, because I have this other side of me, though, that has a high value on adventure and there's a lot of uncertainty, I've had to sit with this tension within myself. So, I've really focused on how do I prepare and how do I mitigate risk in order to come to sort of an internal compromise.
That's really cool. When I think about it's like emotional fitness for risk, right? Where it sounds like it's this kind of like developing a muscle that we've always talked about developing muscles in our podcast, and but it's actually developing this muscle around risk through repeat
Mhm.
exposure and practice. That's really cool. So can you say more about that role of preparation? Because I've noticed in my work and other skilled risk takers are often very meticulous about preparation, even though they might appear spontaneous to others, but they've actually done some of this self awareness and this preparation.
Sure. So let's take the high risk first responders, like a firefighter or the patrollers, right?
Mhm.
So the ones that succeed in the long term aren't just lucky. They've really engaged in a lot of education. Say firefighters, they've engaged in education on fire behavior. They've done training on different scenarios. They've set up procedures and protocols. They've developed contingency plans before going out on your first call. And remember, we're not talking about risk elimination. We're trying to reduce the risk as much as possible. So
Mm.
over time, this builds a psychological resilience because I'm practicing, I'm preparing, I'm mentally running through what can happen. I'm sort of doing scenarios. Like I've been part of a mass casualty sort of training scenario where it's like we're out in the field and the scenario might be that there's a plane crash and we have all the firefighting units, and a lot of our firefighters are volunteer firefighters, so they're just like Karen, you and me decide to become a volunteer firefighter, and we have our regular job, but on weekends we do this training and we do a mass casualty where all the different parts, including the ambulance, triaging,
Mm.
prying open the bus, putting out the fire. So you do these really in life scenarios. So you get the practice of being in that adrenaline state. And over time, that's what builds up the resilience, especially for setbacks.
Mm.
They expect challenges and they have strategies to navigate setbacks.
But that's why the training actually makes the controllable, and then you have minimal uncontrollable things because it's kind of like
Yeah,
the setbacks that you can deal with. Because if you're completely brand new, you're like, oh, where do I begin? Right? You get paralyzed. Like whereas it's almost like you
absolutely.
said, like that muscle. I love that.
Yeah.
So I was even thinking about in the business environment about starting as an entrepreneur. So this is a high risk because you're used to having a job that you go to all the time, you're being paid regularly, all that other things.
Yeah.
And successful people have actually done a lot of market research and build networks of support and research best practices, and as well as has failed in the past. But quote unquote, you would say the dumbass approach would be just to jump into entrepreneurship with no savings, no market validation, and no plan B. And just a sheer belief that your enthusiasm will somehow make it work. Now, I have to admit, when I first was talking about this, I was thinking about, shoot, I'm a dumbass approach. But then I'm realizing, because I don't think I've done like tons of market research, build all my networks of success and research best practices. But I'm realizing now I'm right in between, because remember, that's a spectrum. So that's what I feel better now, having like thought about this more and more. And because I think
because you've done training, right?
Yes, I've done training, my coaching certification. I was part of different programs, and the trainings that I took actually made me better. I just have to get over myself and just plunge in more and more and more and this other stuff. But my point of it is, and I have a plan B, but this is what's interesting to me though, because again, when you are an entrepreneur, it can be difficult, but you have to mentally prepare yourself. It's again the same thing. Like, I have mentally prepared myself for that shift. That's why I'm a badass with small b and small a. That's what I determined.
And I do think I think you're being hard on yourself, Karen. You did build support. You have
and
me.
like you're a support. I said, Christina, why am I doing this?
Yes. You're doing training, you're learning about the different parts of it. You already had networks of other professionals you've worked with in the past.
It's true.
I think you're just being really hard.
All right, let's get back on topic. Enough about me. Okay.
Well, I think one of the ways to think about it is that the badasses have a respect for the risk they're taking.
I love that.
And the dumbasses tend to dismiss it.
True.
Or it's like my dad would say, like, my dad is a risk taker, but he would always tell me, he's like, listen, I take risks, but I'm not reckless. And he really planted that distinction in my head, I think back when I was in my late 20s and 30s, and it really stuck with me. And so it's something I run through my head. Because of that part of me that wants to be adventurous. It's like, okay, you want to take this risk, but don't be reckless. How do you mitigate being reckless?
Yeah, I love that distinction. It's like respect versus dismissal. So the climber actually respects the mountain, which I would never think about until you mentioned this to me. The climber who respects the mountain prepares differently than the one who dismisses its danger. Yeah. And this actually applies beyond physical risk. When I think a little bit about the work that I do, helping people navigate a difficult conversation, because there's emotional risks that you have to prepare differently when someone barges in dismissively to you, or they're going to be a certain way, So sometimes when I work with my clients, it's like, role playing, right? And getting them used to, or finding out the right words that they need to use, because every scenario isn't like a paper cut scenario, right? Because people are different.
Yeah. And the thing is, like in those sorts of scenarios too, say in adventure sports, if I'm going to go climb something I really have no business climbing, I end up paying the consequence, right? I may crash to my death. But what you're talking about, that could end up where it's other people who bear the consequences of that lack of thinking it through. It could be damaged relationships. It could be financial loss.
I also want to add this thing back to difficult conversations, because you and I talk a lot about in communications that words matter. And that's why that relationship could not be built, because the word you use and how you enter. Imagine using the word can you? Of course I can, right? But I loved it when you showed us the word change and are you willing to? It's like a choice. And I just love that small change creates a different dynamic in the conversation. Now, let's go deeper on social influences, how that could actually affect our risk taking. So what are your thoughts on the social pressures, either to take risks we're not prepared for or to avoid risks that might serve our growth?
Well, this is really important because we are social beings. So we should talk about this, that the social element is huge. And I mentioned about peer pressure.
Yeah.
Like peer pressure doesn't end in adolescence, because that's normally where we think about peer pressure, is some after school special, right, during our teen years. But it's just when we are adults, it becomes more subtle. There might be like status seeking or proving ourselves to others, and that could drive us to more dumbass territory quickly. I mean, it really takes a lot of awareness, comfort with boundaries. It takes courage to have some challenging communication. If you're with a group of people and they are going to move towards, say, dumbass choices, takes a tremendous amount of courage to not have that automatic pull to be part of the group and to stand alone. I don't know if those of you who are Harry Potter fans, I can't remember, I think it's in the first Harry Potter where Neville, he actually stands against when Harry's going to break the rules again. And in the end, he ends up getting extra points for Gryffindor because Dumbledore says, well, it's one thing to, stand up against your enemy. It's even harder to stand up against your friends. And
Yeah, I
so,
remember that. Yeah.
yeah. How about you, Karen? Like, where have you seen social pressures?
It's interesting because many people, including myself, have taken career risks to impress others. And I think I took career risks because of my parents. And I don't know if it's career risk or not, but I went to consulting right out of MBA school because everybody goes to consulting right out of MBA school, and I felt like there was some pressure in that. And I kind of feel like it's conforming to social expectations and family expectations for me. And I think it actually has some disappointing results because I feel like that's when I really gained my imposter syndrome, the fear of being kicked out of the cave because I really didn't believe I should have been a consultant. So I think it's interesting how influential impressing others or conform to societal expectations actually is a career risk, and really becoming more self-aware and making the decision because of what you want to do, but not because of the social.
Yeah. It does take a lot of courage. Like, again, going back to my avalanche course, after I took the course, after learning everything that they taught us, I was dating someone at the time, and I realized in the course, one of the things they have you do is a scenario where an avalanche has happened and you have to dig out someone in your party and you're looking for this beacon. Okay. So you have a beacon and it can pick up the other beacon. So you know where they are. First, you have to find them and probe and narrow down. And then you have to dig them out. And they only have, so many minutes before they're going to run out of oxygen.
Oh my gosh, talk about high pressure, man. Oh, yeah.
Okay,
go ahead. I'm like already sweating. I'm like, oh my.
They have you're running through the snow, you're doing your probe, you're in your line, and then you narrow on the beacon, and then you have this little shovel and you're on your knees digging, and the instructor's yelling at you, you only have this many minutes, and you're taking turns and you're digging. And that's when I realized, like, oh man, one, I can't just go backcountry with my partner. It has to be in a group because I can't dig a person out by myself in the time necessary to keep them alive. Yeah. And they can't dig me out probably. And I wanted my partner to take the Abby course. So he had the same training and he wouldn't. And so I told him, I'm like, listen, I will not be able to dig you out in time, and I don't want to be responsible. I don't want to have that on my shoulders. So if you're not willing to take this course, I'm not willing to go in the backcountry with you. And that's talk about.
That was a smart move. Talking about courage.
Yeah. I mean, the whole reason I took it was so we could do this adventure together and then learning what I needed to learn and then having someone who's very high risk tolerant. Oh, I don't need to do that. Oh, it's fine. You don't have to worry. There's not going to be an avalanche. And you're going, yeah, no. And my instructor, because I was still in the course, it was the last day I told one of the instructors, like, hey, man, this is the situation and this is the boundary I had to set. And he looked at me. He's like, holy smokes, you said that? I was like, yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm in this course. I just learned this. He's like, no.
Why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't I do that? Because it's like life and death for me. Yeah, exactly.
No, well, he was like, well, that's rad, right? And so in that moment, I was the badass because that was the risk. That was a social risk. And I was willing to take the social risk. He was like, no, badass.
Yeah. I love that because that's like the authentic risk taking with your deeper values, right? And you have a sense of purpose of why you did that. That's kind of cool. And it reminds me a lot about that whole thing we've talked about before about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, where badass risk taking often comes from your intrinsic values, right? Pursuing something that's meaningful to you and you don't worry about what other people think. And it seems like dumbass risks are frequently driven by extrinsic factors, right? Chasing status, avoiding judgment, or even seeking out validation. So, what do you think about social media? Has that changed this dynamic much?
That's a really good question because you're right. I mean, when you just think about it, like people are always posting.
Yes.
People are posting the ideal, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it kind of creates this new incentive. And then I was just thinking about like all those TikTok challenges during the pandemic, and some of them were like nutso, like
Yeah. The
eating a whole bunch of
TikTok.
cinnamon or
Oh, I
just
know. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
yeah, and then people will be like, "Oh, I wanna be part of this because I wanna post my own video," and I'm especially during the pandemic where people felt really isolated, like, this was a way of feeling connected, and so a
Mm,
lot of people were doing these dumbass challenges and getting hurt and ending up in the hospital, and that was, like, super unique to, I think, just the extent of it was because of the reach of social media, so, yeah, so
yeah.
that's such a good question. That's a really good thing to think about because I do think social media can cause our threshold to get distorted about what
Yeah.
is real. Yeah.
And I think that's the whole point of the video of a risk that goes wow just because it's on social media and there's that still that potential negative influence. But you say, oh, they did it. So you kind of assume it's going to be okay. If they did it, then I could be able to do it. Right. So it's interesting to me. It has really distorted our own perception of what skilled risk taking looks like because we can only see the outcome, but not everybody's preparation.
Yeah, we don't know how many
How many
videos
times they've
happened
tried.
before it, right? So we'll see the viral video, but who knows? Maybe that was thousands of hours. So we don't know. It's very distorting for sure.
So, how would you help us understand how to develop what I would call risk intelligence? So, how can we move ourselves towards the badass end of the spectrum in the risk we actually choose to take?
Well, I think first there's can you do an honest self assessment? Like, do
Mm,
you know your actual skill level and not your imagined skill level? And that requires humility as
yeah.
well as confidence. So, this is key. Insecurity can cause us to underestimate our ability and avoid reasonable risks. And then bravado can cause us to overestimate
Oh, that
our
is interesting.
skills. There's this balance. So we actually have to cultivate both humility and confidence at the same time.
I know from my own experience that when you find that the willingness to seek input from knowledgeable others, not
Mhm.
just anybody, but knowledgeable others, rather than those who are just support you in whatever you want to do, is a sign of maturity actually in risk
Yeah.
assessment. And you have to be humble enough to recognize that you don't know what you really don't know.
Right, right, right. Yes, that we've talked about like we have this big blind spot. I will spend hours researching information, which is what other people might be sharing about the experience
Oh,
of
you
a
do.
particular climb or a mountain bike trail. I really love it when people have a GoPro camera and they do a video of the trail itself so I can see firsthand, is this something that's in my comfort zone? Is it not in my comfort zone? I would read descriptions, say, of a climbing route, and I know there's a certain thing I don't like to do called a traverse. And if I see there's a traverse, it'd be like, nope, no go, no go. Like this has a traverse. I'm not willing to take that risk. So, this is taking the information from experienced people before I make my decision to move forward. And it really helps me identify those risk factors that I need to either just respect or mitigate. And then we've talked about in the past this process of incremental exposure. And for
Yep.
those of you who this is your first time stumbling on our video, that's starting to understand where's your comfort zone, where the stress zone is, and then learning to extend, like go just beyond your comfort zone, not to the point where you're starting to go into sympathetic arousal and a stress response, but you're in discomfort and hanging out in that discomfort zone, testing your ability with low consequence, but still uncomfortable, and then gaining skills. So you're stretching now your comfort zone to be broader. Now you have a new comfort zone and you kind of get skillful there, and then you test yourself by going down into the discomfort zone as distinct from the stress zone. And
Yeah.
that is a way to progressively challenge yourself to
Yeah.
grow.
I mean, I think that's so important. I often, with my coaching clients, give them some challenges. And I'm always asking them with this challenge, I want to stretch them meaningfully, but I don't want to overwhelm them from their current capabilities. Like, I love that, just a little bit over their comfort zone, because it's like if you stretch them too much, and that's why I always say, does this feel right? Because I don't really know for sure, or that we talk about. So I like to call them that right size, like challenge or risk. Right? Because
I'm curious, Karen, when you ask them, like, does this feel right? What do you do, like, if they're like, oh, I don't know, like you see them in the mild discomfort, where that's the stretch, but it's not like, oh man, I can't do that.
So I think it's a matter of exploring. So what I love about what I've done is actually be more curious about it. So it's not just the one question, but have a discussion about that risk, and then take it. So what would be a bigger risk for you then? Right. So it's like trying to right size it. So it's not just like, what I love about what you and I do, whether it be in either of our practices, the same thing, where the curiosity about where they're at and having a discussion with them is so critical to find out what is the right challenge, because everybody's different. And I think you can't just assign a challenge and say, hey, here's your challenge, right? We just have to talk through it to make sure it's the right size.
Yeah, and I know with my clients, sometimes we're, say, working on getting triggered, and I'll have a client come back and say, oh, I had a great week. I didn't get triggered once. And then I'll find out that they basically avoided all possible sources of triggers. And I'll be like, no. We need you to go out and put yourself in a situation where you're likely to get somewhat triggered. And then you can practice the skills we're doing. Of course, you had a great week. You avoided all triggers. So I'm pushing them outside the comfort zone into more daring behavior, but I'm not going to say, okay, no, go to this person who always causes a meltdown for you, where your brain completely shuts off. It'll be a milder trigger, and they'll be like, and then they'll go. So, and like for me, one of them, as I mentioned, is sitting with uncertainty. So to sit with uncertainty, mindfulness practice can really help build this capacity, because it's learning to sit with that discomfort of not knowing. So if I'm mindful, I will actually be super aware of my discomfort, but I'm not having to do action. In mindfulness, I might just be like, oh man, I'm thinking of doing this and I'm feeling the discomfort, and let me just notice. Are there stories going in my head? Am I trying to avoid, like, what's just happening to my body? Can I calm my body? Let me do some breathing. So it's really cultivating that mindfulness practice is a good skill, and learning to develop your ability to start figuring out what that right size is.
And also, there's an importance, though, of also about that contingency plan, where badass risk takers often ask, so what do I do if this doesn't work out? Because you've thought it through, right? Because they will have backup plans and safety nets where possible, but they've at least thought about it.
Yeah, 100%. And we definitely see that with these really successful people who are high risk takers or badasses. And it's not that they're not making a commitment or there's a fear of commitment. It's actually, to me, I would call that, it's wisdom. It enables bolder action because you know that you've considered the worst case scenario. You've thought through, what do I need to do to mitigate? Do I need to do more planning? Do I need to do more training? Do I need to get more information? And so I'm still committed to the action, but I'm doing what's necessary in order to be successful or elevate my probability of success.
Now, before we wrap up, I do think it's worth it to note that the right level of risk really depends on the individual.
Yeah.
Like, what a badass risk for one person, like for me, might actually be a dumbass risk for another with different skills and preparation. And that's so true, right? Because it just depends. Like, I'm not a big risk taker, I don't do the degree of preparation that maybe you would, but I'm still a badass in regards to my risk taking, right? Because it's comparative.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Well, like the backcountry skiing, where my badass action was to say, I'm not going to go with you, as opposed to being like, yeah, okay, you won't take the Abby course and you won't learn about safety.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
exactly.
I want to go in the backcountry. So that's my no, that's my dumbass decision. It's like
Yeah.
the badass was recognizing this is a bad idea and then saying, yeah, no, thank you. Right. So it is different for different people.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is that what you said earlier about self-assessment and knowing yourself is so critical because then you can choose at challenges, right, to help you grow. But as we bring this conversation to a close, what final thoughts do you have on navigating the line between a badass and a dumbass in risk taking?
So I think it comes down to intention,
Ooh,
preparation, and awareness.
good. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The badass risk taker acts with a clear intention through preparation and honest awareness of both my capability and the external situation that I'm moving into. And maybe most importantly, it's understanding that courage isn't the absence of fear, but it's the capacity to act meaningfully despite fear. And that
Mhm.
meaningfully is I'm willing to take all of these steps in order to achieve my goal.
I love that. And I'd add that truly skilled risk taking often looks less dramatic than we might imagine. It's thoughtful, measured, and aligned with our own deeper values. And as you think about your own relationship with risk, we'd like to invite you to think about two questions and consider sharing it in the comments below or emailing us at simplyhuman.connect@gmail.com. And the two questions I'm thinking about to ask you is can you share an example from your life where you took a well prepared, badass risk? What went into your preparation? Have you ever taken a dumbass risk that taught you an important lesson, and what did you learn? Once again, we want to thank you all for joining with us for this exploration of risk taking. We hope it helps you navigate your own challenges as it did ourselves with more awareness and skill. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe.
Until next time, guys, we hope this was helpful for you and gave you something to think about. And until next time, as I always say, stay curious, stay kind, and then we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye, everybody.
Bye, all.